Thank you very much for being here, and for the invitation to be here. I am loath to follow such a tribute to the giants of our field, but I will do my best. What I was originally going to do for you today, according to the program, was to provide you with an overview of Canada's international mining industry from about 1950 to the early 21st century. And as you know, Canada's international mining industry, Canada's mining companies, are subject to a fair bit of criticism, and these are just a couple of the books that have come out in recent years that are quite scathing. In fact, one of them you can find in the back at the U of T stand right there. Canada's mining companies are accused, or many of them are accused, of human rights abuses, political interference, environmental degradation, and a host of other abuses and problems. But from the work that I've done on Canada's mining companies abroad, those arguments aren't always the case, or they don't always stand up. But instead of giving you that overview which makes that point, what I thought I would do is maybe get to the same point by focusing on a more specific case. And that case is perhaps the granddaddy of them all, the project that really started the criticism, or that really attracted the first real bouts of criticism by Canadians and others of a mining company that was operating abroad. And this, of course, is the Exmibal project in Guatemala, undertaken by Inco, the International Nickel Company. So that's, with your indulgence, I'll change things up a little bit, and this is what I'm going to do instead. In 1960, the International Nickel Company of Canada, or Inco, acquired 80% of a nickel project that was owned by the American company Hana Mining in the region of Lago Isabel in eastern Guatemala. And there's Guatemala there, and you can just see Lago Isabel, that big body of water, on the eastern side. At the time, Inco was the largest nickel company in the world, and one of the world's most important mining and metals companies. Its investment in Guatemalan nickel also represented its first, well, not quite, but its first in the post-Second World War period, investment in the global south. So it was a big deal. From the beginning, however, the Exmibal project was subject to a lot of criticism, and it was very, very controversial. It attracted criticism from scholars and critics alike, people like Jamie Swift, Fred Goff, Peter McFarlane, and others. These criticisms built upon the arguments and the criticisms of a group of Guatemalan scholars and economists and activists in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But for Swift and all, and everybody else, Inco's investment in Guatemala represented a prime example of what was coming to be known as dependent development, or dependent underdevelopment, whereby the natural resource wealth of a developing country was exploited for the benefit of a foreign multinational corporation rather than for the benefit of the people of Guatemala itself. More specifically, Inco is said to have done a number of abuses, everything from profiting from Guatemala's political turmoil to secure its nickel concessions. It's accused of rewriting Guatemala's mining code for its own benefit. It's accused of dealing with a small coterie of corrupt officials within the Guatemalan elite and government in order to profit its business. It's accused of minimizing or maximizing its profitability, at the expense of minimizing the taxes and royalties it paid and the social and economic benefits that accrued to Guatemala. Most egregiously, perhaps, it's accused of benefiting directly and depending upon the efforts of the Guatemalan military to suppress societal opposition to Exmibal, both in the country in general and in the region around Lago Isabel in particular. And you can see the various concessions around Lago Isabel. The purpose of this paper is to reassess the validity of some of these criticisms, because much of the current literature, much of the current criticisms of Canadian mining companies actually harken back to that original Inco case and sort of say, see, this has been going on for so long. There's a long-standing history of Canadian abuses in the mining industry. So what I'd like to do is, making use, a number of years ago, I was lucky enough to actually gain access to some Inco archives, and making use of those records as well as other sources. This paper argues that at least some of the criticisms of Inco need to be reconsidered or nuanced, that in fact the relationship between Inco and the Guatemalan government and Inco's activities in Guatemala was much more complex and much more nuanced than has been acknowledged to this point. The project starts in 1960 with Inco's acquisition of an 80% stake in eastern Guatemala's nickel deposits, which really did represent an important part of Inco's efforts to maintain control and dominance of the international nickel industry. Yet Inco's interest in Guatemala developed during a very turbulent time for the country. This comes in the aftermath, of course, of the 1954 CIA-sponsored coup, which overthrew the Jacobo Arbenz government and ushered in a series of military governments and military-supported governments in the country that lasted for several decades. It also was the period, by the late 1950s, early 1960s, this was also the period of, or also saw the emergence of armed rebellions in the country that were centered in the very same parts of eastern Guatemala where Inco's concessions happened to be. And this instability, violence, and political upheaval had a significant effect on the Exmibal project, and particularly on Guatemalan and other public perceptions of the project. Well, for the first couple of years of the early 1960s, Inco spent those years testing and exploring on its deposits. But by the mid-1960s, it's ready to convert its exploration concessions into mining concessions. Well, that conversion, those mining concessions, were granted in August of 1965. Only a couple of months, however, after the promulgation of a new mining code in Guatemala. What makes it controversial, however, is that mining code was proclaimed by the government of Enrique Peralta Azurdia, who was a military officer who had come to power in 1963 as a result of a coup, overthrowing the previous military government. But Peralta Azurdia had subsequently suspended Guatemala's constitution and was ruling the country by decree. So, as a result, many Guatemalans didn't accept the legitimacy of the government, didn't accept the legitimacy of the mining code, and proclaimed and criticized the new concession for being made by an illegal government or an undemocratic government passed under an illegal code. Okay? And this was a mining code, by the way, that significantly reduced the burdens, tax burdens and other burdens on mining companies, not just Inco, but all prospective mining companies. This criticism of the mining code and of Inco was only intensified when it emerged later that Inco itself had hired a Peruvian mining engineer by the name of Emilio Godoy in 1963 to help rewrite the code. Now, the other major factor that affected public perceptions of the Exmibal project, and it's a much more weighty one, was the campaign that was begun in November of 1966 by the Guatemalan military to eliminate armed rebels from the hills surrounding Lago Isabel and to pacify the region. In all, between 1966 and 1968, Colonel Carlos Arana Osorio and military and paramilitary forces killed between an estimated 3,000 and 15,000 people, mostly civilians, mostly peasants, Maya peasants, earning Arana the nickname the Butcher of Zacapa. Inco and Exmibal were directly linked to and deemed to benefit from this brutal campaign of violence, which pacified eastern Guatemala. That's not the end of the criticism, of course, for Inco. Exmibal was also heavily criticized in June of 1968 when the Guatemalan government, after much lobbying on the company's behalf, declared the company a transformative industry under Guatemalan industrial law, which entitled the Exmibal to a full exoneration of taxes on smelting, part of its project, for a period of 10 years, and a 50% reduction of those taxes for another 5 years after that. It was this type of concession to ExMIBAL that really galvanized opposition to ExMIBAL within a particular institution in particular. And that was the University of San Carlos, which is the biggest and most prestigious university in Guatemala, but more particularly the Faculty of Economics. And in May of 1969, the economics faculty arranged and held a roundtable on the ExMIBAL project, a 3-day public hearing, which was very, very critical of the project and resulted in the publication of a booklet entitled ExMIBAL contra Guatemala. The entire premise of this was that the project was not in the interests of the country at all. These economists, joined by other intellectuals and nationalists, criticized ExMIBAL and the Guatemalan government for enabling the exploitation of Guatemala's mineral wealth for the benefit of a foreign corporation. What's interesting is that the widespread criticism, the eruption of widespread criticism after May of 1969 did have a significant effect on the Guatemalan government. By the summer of 1970, the government of Arana Osorio, remember the butcher of Zacapa, he had been elevated to the presidency in July of 1970. Upon becoming president of Guatemala, he declared that there needed to be renegotiations of the deal that had been signed in 1968. Arana Osorio still supported ExMIBAL project, still considered it important to the government and to the country. Yet, faced with such public criticism of the company, or of the concessions that were awarded to ExMIBAL, the president also stressed that he, quote, needed a better deal, unquote, from the company in order for it to proceed. By October of 1970, Arana had appointed a 6-person commission to renegotiate an agreement with ExMIBAL, and by February of 1971, after very, very difficult negotiations, a deal was finally reached by which ExMIBAL agreed to a variety of concessions, the most important of which was that Inco agreed to give up 50% of its tax breaks that it had received in 1968, the proceeds from which would be used to finance the government's acquisition of a 30% stake in ExMIBAL. So Guatemala became a partner in the ExMIBAL project. ExMIBAL also agreed to produce refined nickel, 60 million pounds of refined nickel in the country rather than just nickel, smelted nickel matte. Now, the problem was, or another one of the problems was that even this negotiated settlement in 1971 didn't end the problems for the ExMIBAL project. It came in the midst of a global downturn in the nickel economy and the nickel industry. It also came right in the middle of a new state of political turmoil in Guatemala. From November of 1970 to November of 1971, the Guatemalan government declared a state of siege where it suspended the Constitution, it suspended all rights in the country, and the Guatemalan military and paramilitary forces engaged in another brutal campaign of anti-insurgency, or anti-insurgent campaign. It should also be noted that between December of 1970 and January of 1971, 2 members of the Faculty of Economics Anti-ExMIBAL Commission that had met in 1969 were assassinated. Well, the big problem, of course, for Inco was that all of these factors, the downturn in the economy, the political upheaval and everything, made it very, very difficult for Inco to secure the financing, the private financing that it needed to pursue the project. So it took another deal in February of 1973 before Inco and the Guatemalan government were able to agree on a much scaled-back version of the project that allowed the project to proceed, and construction began in 1978. On a scaled-down version of the project, the first ore was mined in 1978. Much was made at the time that ExMIBAL represented the first big investment by a foreign company in Guatemala's mining industry. So it really was supposed to set the template. And for many people it did. That this was the epitome of a wholesale giveaway of a country's natural resources to a foreign company. To what extent, however, are the criticisms that ExMIBAL and Inco have been subjected to what extent are they still valid? Well, based on my reading of INCO's sources and archive material in this, some of the criticisms are still valid. Some of them are. For example, it is true INCO did hire a mining engineer to help rewrite the Guatemalan mining code. It's not clear exactly how much of those revisions actually made it into the final version. Some did. INCO's officials talked about that. But INCO's officials also complained bitterly about the taxes imposed upon the company by the Mining Code of 1965. So it's also fairly clear that they didn't get everything that they wanted. Okay? Nonetheless, there is also some truth to the argument made by several that INCO wasn't really all that interested in mining nickel in Guatemala anyway. All it really wanted to do was to control the resources, control the deposits. There is some truth to that. INCO at the same time was pursuing two other major projects in New Caledonia and Indonesia. And it would have been content to pursue any one of them. It ultimately did pursue two. But the Guatemalan one was the furthest advanced and the most ready to go. And it wasn't really reluctance to pursue the project in Guatemala that was really delaying it. It really was the inability to secure international or to private financing for the project. That was really what was holding it up. A bigger charge, of course, is about the relationship between INCO and the Guatemalan military, the Guatemalan government, and that it is clear that there was a fairly close, although not quite as close, a relationship between the two as is often considered to be the case. It's much more ambiguous. INCO's officials did consider the military the key institution in Guatemala. They took a great deal of care to brief the military on the Exmibal project. They did, in fact, hire, this is one of the more interesting findings that I found, they hired a former member of the U.S. military intelligence with extensive experience in Central America. And if you know what the U.S. military was doing in Central America in the 1960s, you know what that means. They hired that individual as their government relations expert, which I think says a fair bit about what was going on. And it's also clear that INCO's officials considered what was going on in Guatemala in terms of the struggle between capitalism and freedom on the one hand and communism on the other hand, so in very Cold War terms. However, it does need to be stated from my perspective that neither Exmibal nor INCO were responsible for the pacification campaigns that took place in eastern Guatemala between 1966 and 1968. That was a manifestation of political violence that represented a broader struggle within Guatemala between advocates of competing visions of economic and societal development, which was a conflict that encompassed, of course, the resources, the nickel deposits, but was not caused by them. Where the record does need to be revised a little bit from my perspective, however, and here's just a couple of concluding remarks, INCO's records do reveal a company that was struggling to come to terms with a changed environment. It was struggling to come to terms with new expectations about corporate social responsibility and the benefits to host societies from resource development. J.D. Pagan, for example, an INCO executive, was routinely urging his INCO superiors to accept a lower threshold of profitability in Guatemala in order to secure the necessary societal support for the project, something that would be called social license today. And remember, this took place in the context of the nationalizations in the copper industry in Chile in the early 1970s. So this was very much part of the environment. And it was that kind of debate within INCO itself that actually led to the Guatemalan government taking on an ownership stake in Exmibal, for example. But for me, perhaps the biggest point of reconsideration has to do with INCO's supposed influence over the Guatemalan government and the degree to which it shaped Guatemala's mining industry and regulations to its own benefit and to its own interests. For me, there's a fair bit of truth to that up until 1968. But once we get into 1969, and particular after the eruption of public criticism from the Faculty of Economics at San Carlos University, you do see public pressure forcing the government of Guatemala into a much more hardline position vis-a-vis the company. After 1969, in particular 1970, 1971, the Guatemalan government became much more effective in demanding and getting concessions from INCO on a number of different levels. So for me, it's difficult to see from these negotiations the degree to which the Guatemalan government was really subjected or dominated by the interests of a foreign company in this particular case. The resulting agreement did not satisfy everybody, or in fact didn't even satisfy many of Ex-Nival's critics, yet it was very much the strength of public opposition and public criticism in Guatemala to the project that actually compelled the government to take a much harder line in its dealings with the company. And I'll just conclude with this. So INCO's relationship with the Guatemalan government was much more complex and nuanced than is often thought to have been the case, which raises the possibility for me, and this is where my research is going for everything else, if INCO's relationship in Guatemala, or a project in Guatemala, was more complex and nuanced, then so too may be other Canadian mining projects abroad as well. Thank you very much.